Hey, Becker, Scotty, how you guys doing?
Hey, T-Mac. Pretty good. What's going on over there?
Craziness. I read today in Beatles history, a crazy fact. Do you know that today was the day that the turtlenecks the Beatles wore on the With the Beatles cover were knighted by the Queen? It's unbelievable. So now it happened in 1972. Now every time you move one of those turtlenecks, you have to say, "I'm moving Sir Paul's Sir Black turtleneck." Unbelievable.
It's going to cause a lot of confusion for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Andrew Becker, and this is Blotto Beatles. Thank you for tuning in and joining us for our inaugural podcast. We are the world's leading The Beatles inebriated interloculators.
Nailed it.
And tonight, and for together always on this adventure, I'm joined in our virtual studio by my co-host, the McCartney to my Lennon, T-Mac.
I'm going to say Lennon to your McCartney.
Oh, man, we can argue about this for a while. We have 200 episodes. Also in the studio with us tonight is prudent producer Scott Celeste. How's everyone doing?
I like to call him the George Martin of New England.
I am loving this, and I will take it on as his official new title. This is a podcast that we've been intending to do for a long time. We'd always intended to do this together in the same room, but it's unfortunate that it took a global pandemic for us to become inspired to try and tackle this under quarantine from each of our own homes. Ultimately, this podcast was first pitched to me by T-Mac, and so T-Man, what inspired you, and why are we here today?
I think that with my friends, one of the greatest things we've always done is you get together, you have dinner, you have a couple drinks, and then you get into these deep conversations. And one of the best conversations I've had with you guys is always digging into the Fab Four and what we really think of them, who the best ones are, what are the best songs, what are the worst songs, a little bit of an argument that doesn't mean anything the next day when it's all said and done. So we're here to give you the definitive list of when you've had a couple drinks, what do the Beatles songs mean, best to worst, in the catalog, in the pantheon, in the greater world. So here we are.
I know I'm going to get letters about this, and we're probably going to get tweets upon tweets, but I think that if I was going to make a stance about this podcast, is that rock and roll for me starts with the Beatles. Because of how hard I fell into the Beatles, it's very hard for me to go past that and sort of find the brilliance in their influences. And you know, they named Chuck Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly, and all that is all fine and well. But I have had a tough time ever going past the Beatles. That's where it starts for me, and that's where it's expanded and changed my entire life.
Well, what I'll say first of all is you talked about letters a minute ago, and I think it's really important that people know that after May 4th, I will not be answering any letters from a place of peace and love. I think, yeah, it's really important. You know, I just don't have the time to do that.
Peace and love.
But
peace and love.
Exactly what you're saying. I think the Beatles are the starting point for me in my musical journey. What I'll say is, I do remember a really specific moment. I was in second grade on the playground. My best friend Colin came up to me and he said, "I figured it out. We're going to start a band." And I said, "All right, let's do this." Well, what's going on? Neither of us played an instrument or had ever touched an instrument or had ever really talked about music. And he said, "Well, I heard about this band. They're called the Beatles." and we're gonna start a band, and it's gonna be called the Beatles 2. And the first song we're gonna play is "Help." And that's it. And our friends Noah and Bennett are going to be in the band with us, and it's going to be awesome. You are going to be Paul McCartney. I will be John Lennon. Our friend Bennett will be George, and Noah will be the Ringo, because I'm pretty sure he has a bongo drum. We never got in the same room together. We never played a song, but the Beatles 2 just ignited that spark of making me go home and figure out who these people were, what they did, and that spark never left. It ignited into a flame.
Do you think there's any chance for the 200th episode anniversary that we could maybe get Beatles 2 into the studio? And just to confirm for all the listeners, is it the number 2 or is it TOO?
That's a great question. And what I'm going to say to you is, being in second grade, I'm not sure that we knew the difference between the two at that point in time. But yeah, for like, easily a $500,000 guarantee, I think we can get Beatles 2 here rocking I Want to Hold Your Hand.
I'm guessing by this point we'll probably have that sweet bonobos money, and so we'll probably be fine. That's probably
Squarespace. Are you listening? We're here. We're here.
Stamps.com. Line up that money. Yeah. You want to hear Beatles 2? They're available. Real quick, I've done a little bit of research about the Beatles, and you tell me if I'm right here, but I really dove in. From what I have read, 3 lovable, long-haired brothers from Oklahoma who bopped their way into the hearts and minds of America and ultimately the world. Does that sound right to you?
You're so close. You're like,
not Oklahoma?
You're on the edge. You're right there. It's like tip of your tongue. It's sort of perfect right there.
Like I said, I love the Beatles. I believe rock and roll starts and ends there. For me, the Beatles had existed in my life. I think I had heard it. And I think when we start talking about the track we're talking about today, I want to reveal a little bit more about that. It had been sort of background music in my world. In second, third, fourth grade, something like that, my family moved to Cape Cod, and my dad had sort of renovated the basement downstairs and put some couches down there and his record player and his old records. I went down there to hang out. It was sort of a rainy or snowy day, and the 2 records I immediately pulled out just based on the covers alone were Tommy the Who, that I listened to front to back, and found that to be amazing. But I also pulled out Sgt. Pepper's and listened to that record. And what I had thought the Beatles were from sort of the oldies music that had been happening like in the car and things like that just changed my entire world. Looking at the cover of that record, hearing what was happening on the record, changed everything about me. I believed it altered my entire trajectory to this point. And through everything, I carried for a long, long time that the Beatles were my favorite band. I went through being a punk rock kid in high school, and no matter what, if someone asked, I would say, "Oh, the Beatles are still my favorite band." And something happens later in life that the Beatles become a little bit almost background music in a way. It's not that interesting to sort of be like, "Oh, I think the Beatles are the best band." And so there's probably some wave of my life that sort of tempered that a little bit, but I always felt that the Beatles were my favorite band. I don't think I ever lost that torch. And I always listened to the Beatles in various waves throughout my entire life.
So I have 2 things. That's amazing. And I have 2 things I'd like to add to that. The first is Becker. You're still punk. All right. We all know it.
We're all punk, right?
Yeah, we're all pretty punk.
You're wearing a Mike Watt shirt.
Yeah.
As long as you guys think I'm punk, I think you're punk.
All right. And the second thing I want to add is, so, you and I are the co-hosts of this show, and that's great. And I think we're going to probably end up doing the majority of the talking, but there are 3 of us here. And I think the 3 of us are here because we all find this band to be a center point of kind of what we listen to, but also how we conduct our daily lives. And so I'd love to hear a little from producer Scotty about his version of this question. Why are the Beatles so important to you? What did they mean to you?
Well, I I will say my mother was one of the girls screaming at the television when they came on to Ed Sullivan's show, and she's always liked them, especially the early stuff, the poppy, awesome, fun rock and roll music they were playing. And I remember hearing, like Becker said, the oldies in the car, if you want to call them that, all those classic hits. And I honestly did not get into the deeper artistic Beatles until I was in my late teens, early 20s. And then it just hit like a ton of bricks, especially, I think I started at the White Album, and, there's so much there, there's so much depth, and then you just branch off and it just takes you away. Took me away.
That's awesome, man. Thank you.
And that's why I'm so pumped to be here sort of later in life, like starting to unpack all of this. And what does it mean to be impacted early on by this? What does it mean throughout your life to have been impacted by this? And what does it mean now for us to all to be sort of talking about this in our mid to late 80s? So I'm really happy to really just
I'm 64.
You've been 64 for 16 years.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Hey, cheers to being 64. All of us a toast. All right, Becker, you've had the mic for a minute here, and we've all explained who the Beatles are to each of us, and that's great. But I think, for the public, maybe this is their first episode. Maybe they just clicked the button on Spotify or on Stitcher, and they don't know who these four lovable lads from Liverpool are. And so it's up to us in a really concise amount of time to explain now who were the Beatles. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask producer Scotty C, set the clock for 60 seconds.
Got you.
We're each going to take a turn. We each have a minute. You right now have 60 seconds. I'm going to take my headphones out. You have 60 seconds to say, who are the Beatles?
All right. And introducing the Beatles to you in 60 seconds. The Beatles are four lovable lads from Liverpool, a core group of John, Paul, George, and later they meet Ringo. They've been rocking covers at the Cavern Club in Hamburg for a while. They catch the ear of some other folks and like, hey, you guys should be really famous. Early 60s, they blow up. They come to the United States. Beatlemania, it's happening everywhere. But then they smoke a little bit of weed. They try LSD, and they get tired of touring, and they decide that they're a studio band. They put out Sgt. Pepper's, which is sort of a rough concept album, but raises the bar on everyone. Meanwhile, they're met as boys, and they are becoming men, and they're sort of getting sick of each other. And so John leaves his first wife. He gets involved with Yoko Ono. They put out an amazing record called The White Album, which really starts to illustrate that they are sort of going their separate ways, but still together as a band. They go on to put out two more fantastic albums, but possibly disjointed sort of feeling in Abbey Road and Let It Be. They sling stones in the media for a few years. They've broken up, and sadly, we lose John. He's murdered in 1980. We lose George in 2001, and now I'm just happy knowing that Paul and Ringo are still alive today to be part of this podcast when they choose to. Yes!
Fuck yeah!
You nailed it?
T-Mac, I don't want to say I did it, but
Are you
I
feeling
might have
high
done
or
it.
what, dude? That must have felt good.
All right. I'm ready to give it a shot here.
Who needs 200 episodes?
So I hear Becker did pretty well here, nailing on his first take what the Beatles were in 60 seconds. I'm a little shocked, and I'm ready to go. So the Beatles were really three boys from Liverpool who later found Ringo, and they started playing the Cavern Club. They started branching out into Europe and then found their way into America. And when they found their way into America, Beatlemania really took hold. They were a pop band at that time, talking about, a boy loving a girl a lot. They toured, they got sick of touring, and what they really found was that when they removed themselves from touring, found their way back into the studio, they could talk about what they really wanted to talk about, which was more about what it meant to be a human being. They kind of changed the world. They talked about peace. They talked about love. They, and maybe with or without, who knows, the effect of drugs, things like marijuana and LSD really changed the way people thought. The White Album, Abbey Road, at the end of their career, just really molded what it meant to be a rock and roll band at that point and finds its way into today.
All right, so we've let the people know who we are. We've let the people know who the band the Beatles are. But I don't think we've talked about what this show is.
What I just realized is that in my 60 seconds, I didn't talk about Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Never heard of it.
But you brought up marijuana and LSD. So,
so that counts. I got you. All right. So yeah, okay. What the show? Let's talk about the show a little bit. I think that really what we're here to do is we're three friends and we're here to have a couple drinks, and we're going to each episode talk about one Beatles song is going to be the focus of our episode, right?
I think that's exactly right. I think that we pre-party a little bit. We hop on the line, we have a couple of drinks, and then we decide to roll tape and we continue to drink. Unbeknownst to the audience, a couple of days prior to that, producer Scotty C has picked one song and only one song that he reveals to us. And we start sort of forming a little bit of an opinion, a little bit of stance, a little bit of general research about it, and get ready to talk about it.
So what Wikipedia tells us, and that is the source for all valid information, is that between the years of 1962 and 1970, the Beatles released 213 songs, 4 of which exist in different versions. So we got 188 originals and 25 covers. We're going to add Free as a Bird and Real Love into the mix from those anthology years. We might add some other things into the mix as we go. Maybe we're talking about the Fan Club Christmas records. Maybe we're doing a little video commentary for Hard Day's Night. Who knows? But we're going to talk about the concept of one Beatles idea, one Beatles song most times in every episode.
And, we enter the podcast, I think we all have some thoughts. We all have some notes about where we want to go. But wherever sort of the drinking and the conversation and the fun of the moment takes us is what we're going to talk about. We do have a couple of song pick rules. One is that we're always going to be alternating albums. An album is not eligible for selection again until we've bopped around to at least 2 other albums.
We're also going to alternate Beatles, primary songwriters. So we're not going to do 2 John songs in a row. We're going to go John, Paul, George, the occasional Ringo tune when it comes up. And that rule will stand until it gets a little problematic when, there aren't so many of the other Beatles writing.
I'd like to believe that we're going to end this all on a Ringo song, that we're going to hold on to, I don't want to influence the producer Scotty, but maybe it's Octopus's Garden. Maybe
I'm going to
that's
say
the
maybe
big
Good Night is the last episode.
Ooh, man,
wow. My brother said he wanted to be buried to that song.
Oh, man.
That's dark.
Octopus's Garden. Does he feel a special way about octopuses?
No, Good Night.
Oh, Good Night. Oh, okay.
Get it. It makes way more sense. Here's a little fun thing that we have happening here, though, is the magical mystery word. Scotty C, he selects a word unknown to us per episode, and upon hearing that word, the show must immediately stop, record scratch, and each of us has a shot on standby that we must immediately drink. And throughout the episode, we must drink every time that word appears.
All right. So the last point here is that we are here to talk about the Beatles. We are 3 friends talking about one episode every show, but we want to have an end product. And that end product will be the definitive list of when you've had a couple drinks. How do the Beatles songs rank? What are they? How do they rank best to worst? We will every episode rank those Beatles songs. We will say this was better than that one or worse than that one. And we reserve the right to regret those decisions in the very next episode, but they will stand.
Absolutely. And we hope to create this list in a way that sort of silences all of the arguments. if you're having a couple of drinks with your friends and you can't agree on the Beatles songs, this is the canonical list. This can't be argued with. We are marking it in stone.
It's definitive. Even if we disagree with it, this is what it is.
And once we say where that song goes, that's where that song goes.
At the end of the day, though, everybody, as Becker said, we want to hear from you. We're going to say some things under inebriation. We're going to have some spotty facts. We're going to say some things that immediately we regret. And we want you to drop us a line. We want you to let us know what you think. We want you to give us corrections. We want you to get that going. And so you can do that in a number of ways. The first is to hit us up at Twitter at Blotto Beatles. That same tag, that same handle also satisfies Instagram at Blotto Beatles. Show us a picture of you having a drink listening to the Beatles, maybe, or old-fashioned way, as maybe, Yoko used to write to John on Gmail. Hit us up, blottobeatles at gmail.com.
All right, we're back here with Blotto Beatles, and this is the reason you tuned in. We choose one song a week, and we're about to reveal it to you now, and we're about to dive in and tell you what we think about it. Earlier this week, Scotty C texted us, and he said, this is the tune we're talking about. Scotty C, why don't you tell us why you chose All My Lovin'?
All right. I picked All My Lovin'. This is the first episode. I needed to pick a starting point. Maybe I thought too much about this, but honestly, I think too much about everything. I wanted something that wasn't too obscure, too silly, too heavy, too hard for us to dive right into. So I went with All My Lovin'. It's a beautiful, poppy love song. It's got excellent rhythm and excellent melody, and it's just a great tune. Also, this was what they kicked off the Ed Sullivan Show with. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here are the Beatles. Whatever. Close your eyes. I mean, here we go. And for some people, it started here, and it took them to a whole nother place, or maybe they dropped off and new people showed up later. But whatever. I mean, this is a good starting point, I think, for the show, and that's why I picked it. I also read an interesting thing about it that this is a Paul song. You can tell, he's got that great voice, and so one of the things about this song that I found very interesting was he wrote the lyrics first and then wrote the music to it afterwards, where he said he's never done that before, and he's pretty much never done it since. And that's a really interesting thing to me. Here's why I picked All My Lovin', and I think it's a beautiful song.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you. Remember, I'll always be true.
All right. Fantastic. Scotty C, amazing place to kick this off. To kick us off as a podcast, to introduce all of our soon-to-be fans, to say, what do these fellas think about this song? I think I can start and talk a little bit about sort of my initial take when you sent me the tune to think about and start preparing for the show. My exposure to this stuff of early Beatles is mostly on oldies radio. My mom would sort of drive around and listen to this, and what they would play of the Beatles is probably just shy of Rubber Soul. It felt like. And so there was a lot of this, the notion, All My Lovin', I Want to Hold Your Hand, these sort of very boy writing a song about a girl tunes. And I think I really put Beatles in that compartment for a long, long time. And then once I had sort of been exposed to Sgt. Pepper's and Revolver and wanted to go backwards a little bit more, it was tougher back then, right? Every time you wanted to sort of explore a record, you had to trot yourself down to Tape World, maybe at the Falmouth Mall, and you had to spend, $20 and figure out if this was a record that you would like. And so for the most part, I got the red that red album that covers the Beatles from 1962 to 1966. And that for me was the longest time of sort of these songs being put on record and listening to them back to back to back. And so I was less familiar of this music in the context of an album. And I don't know for you, T-Mac, if it was any different, or if Meet the Beatles was important to you.
No, I totally agree. And actually, I came into the Beatles in a different way, and it was probably really, maybe I didn't come into the Beatles in a different way. I really came in through Sgt. Pepper, and definitely that red cassette and the blue cassette that led up until 1970 were really important in my introduction. I think looking back on it now, it's a much different song. Instrumentally, I think this song is actually pretty important. Lyrically, it is what it is. And that's what I find really funny about Paul kind of bragging about the fact that he started with the lyrics is the lyrics are kind of banal. They're like, it's all the same what the Beatles had done to that point, right? And this is, by the time they're writing this, it's at their second record in the UK. Now, it is an introductory song for the United States, which is a whole different animal and something a little weird to reconcile, as a 40-year-old in 2020. But instrumentally, what I'm looking at here is you've got that John guitar part that he's playing these triplets. He's running the song from start to end, and Paul's got his walking bass going on. That kind of helps it. I did read something with Paul where he thought this song was a country western song originally. When he first wrote it, he thought it was going to be a country western song. And I think that probably John's guitar takes in a different direction. It's definitely Beatles pop, but it's a little different instrumentally. And I would kind of argue that it might be a little more mature than, something like Can't Buy Me Love or She Loves You in terms of what the music is doing. The lyrics are probably very similar, but I think that the instruments are doing something a lot more interesting and something that you can find echoes in that later Beatles stuff that I think the three of us are maybe a little more drawn to on a regular basis. So,
that's why I think it's interesting. I did read that part about Paul writing the words first and him almost thinking about it as a poem, but he rhymes you and you. I mean, he uses you 3 times in the first verse, So it's like, is this even a good poem on its own? Is it certainly it's a much better song than it is a poem. I'm not even going to ask that question. But the two of it, those two things coming together, clearly is working very well. I think overall, I never really thought all that much. And I think this is probably something that I'm kind of ashamed about, quite honestly, about music in general. And I think it's a little bit naive about the fact that I'm not a musician. Maybe it's worth pointing out here that for this podcast, T-Mac and Scotty C are fantastic and accomplished musicians in their own right. I don't feel that way. And so for me, I think for a long, long time, I did not hear music, and very specifically this era of the Beatles, I did not hear it as individual instrumentation. I heard it more as vocals and a band sort of driving that forward. And it wasn't until way later that probably late 20s, that I thought about dissecting any of this work to revisit the early Beatles.
So what I'll say to that is I totally hear you. And there are times I go back and I wish I could hear music that way too. Like just the whole experience, rather than being like, oh, what's the bass player doing or what's the guitar player doing? And your notes about us being very accomplished musicians, especially in regards to me, are very kind and untrue. But what I want to do in moving this forward a bit is say that I think this song, as early as it is a bridge to some of the later Beatles. And so I sent Scotty C a link earlier to a different version of this song. And in a second, I'm going to ask him to cue it up. And I'll give a little preamble first as he's getting ready, I'm sure. I have 3 daughters at home. And as they were growing up, being the dad that I am, who's had being the dad that's had music as a really important part of his life, I've wanted to try and just expose them to that, which was something that I didn't necessarily have as a young man. And part of that was through the Rock-A-Baby records, which are super silly. And what they do is they take artists that are really famous and they transpose the music into xylophones and electronic keyboards and things that are more lullaby centric. So things like Radiohead and the Beatles are big rockabye sounds. I went back, and when Scott brought All My Lovin' to us, I went back and I listened to the All My Lovin' version from the rockabye family, and I started to say there might be something a little more here. So, Scott, if you could cue us up at around 45 seconds of that rockabye record, I'd appreciate it.
This is such a good Radiohead cover of the Beatles.
So in my mind, what we're hearing there is evidence of the later Beatles. It's there. They're using the instrumentation from something like Sgt. Pepper's in that song. And when you put those instruments to these chords, I think you hear where the Beatles are going. I don't know that it's the same for a song like Can't Buy Me Love. I think that this is a song that is kind of a turning point. And we've talked about this already, that I can make grand proclamations here today and I can take them back next episode. And I'm happy to do that. And I might say that every Beatles song is a turning point, but I really feel like this has the evidence to say, here's where we go.
And think about yourself, T-Mac very specifically, think about yourself as a young teen during Beatlemania.
I often do.
Paul McCartney comes on TV and he is telling you, I'm not there with you right now, but I'll pretend that I'm kissing the lips that I'm missing. It almost lets you project yourself onto this song so hard, in a way that you never had anything to sort of apply yourself to. Like even all of the influences that we want to talk about, sort of the heartthrobs and things that had come before this, people did not have anything like this. And so Ed Sullivan introduces this. These folks are in your living room. And, this is words, feelings, and emotions that a man has sort of never said. I think it is crazy impactful. I don't for one second want to say that we're diminishing sort of that this is cheesy or that this isn't, revolutionary in its own right. The Beatles got where they got, and they got to the moment that sort of probably what we worship a bit more than this, but they got there because of this. I don't believe for one second that, while Paul McCartney is saying, he's giving you all my loving, and they're saying, I want to hold your hand. Like at the same point, I don't know that that's the life that they're living. From what I've read about hanging out at the Cavern Club, they're as young men, they're meeting women, they're getting some life experiences in versus the way that sort of media wanted to paint them. And so I think that this is all a start, in some way, they're up to the same sort of lewdness that almost the Rolling Stones wanted to portray from day one. They just weren't telling you about it. They're going to hold your hand. But I believe that there's still something almost, I don't want to say nefarious, because there's nothing nefarious about
but
this
the Rolling
song.
Stones are saying, I want satisfaction. Right.
Yes,
and the Beatles are saying, I want to hold your hand. And there's a difference.
Demanding it, You know what I really like here, and part of what I think I always want to talk about, and I always want to find across sort of the things that I worship, I always want to find sort of a through line. And for me, this sentiment in the song, All My Loving, is something that I really like. Like at its core, I love the notion of saying all of my love. And one of my favorite Zeppelin tunes is All of My Love. And I feel like in some way, saying all of my love is really the strongest sentiment you can have. And in some way, like it is how I would like to say that I enter all of the things of my life with all of my love. I don't believe that is necessarily true. But that notion of saying all of my love, I believe to be super strong. And so when I sort of criticize this as poetry on its own or things like that, like this is also like something that I buy in on, you know?
Right. And I think, you know, maybe I don't believe them this early, but when you look later and they're writing and singing on television, All You Need Is Love, and McCartney in the background is doing the lyrics to She Loves You as a part of that tune, and bringing that back in to say, like, you know, okay, maybe we didn't buy in at the time, like maybe we're just doing it for what we were doing it, but as you get older, there's something more true to that, and I think we all recognize that, right? And that's a little bit of why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's hard to argue with. For sure. I think the way that, and I hope we build on this completely, but the way that sort of the Beatles weave in the word love very much on its own, I think has a ton of connotations. You know, it's also something that becomes super co-opted by the whole hippie movement of the late 60s. You know, something that the Beatles, although only in like their late 20s, sort of already were like, we're not part of this, and we don't necessarily want anything to do with it. But it comes back multiple times. And is this where it starts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it starts in so many ways, right? Like it starts right here because of what they're talking about. It starts right here because this is the first song that the United States is introduced to for the Beatles. Ed Sullivan says, the Beatles, and this is what they go into. And the amazing thing for me about that is that this was not a single. They didn't put this on a 45. And when you look at songs of the era and how 45s were released versus how albums were released, albums were nothing at the time. And this is the song they kicked it off with. They didn't even know how good the song was until later in the time. I mean, it's a song that doesn't make its way until the second album for the Beatles in the UK with the Beatles. And somehow it makes it on Meet the Beatles, the first introduction that the United States gets to the Beatles on Capitol Records.
And this is probably something that we're going to talk into the ground. Is I also think that the Beatles are unaware of albums at this point, right? Like they're not thinking that I need to string along a perfect A side and a perfect B side, right? They were churning out tunes that the record labels and whoever was getting the rights in sort of whatever countries you were in were sort of deciding how to chop and put together. And I think that's what we have in sort of with the Beatles and Meet the Beatles, and how sort of the UK digested the Beatles and how we sort of got it just a little bit later before it blew up.
Right. But I think it's still crazy. Like, I'll take this back later, maybe. I think when you get to She Loves You, this is a better song than She Loves You. I think this is a better song than Can't Buy Me Love. This song rings truer in the way that the band comes together in a lot of ways. I mean, I know I've talked a lot about the instrumentation, and, you know, I just don't think the lyrics are much special. They are like talking to it's more of the same. It's more of like Can't Buy Me Love, She Loves You, like me talking to a girl, P.S. I love you, like hitting P.S. I love you, kind of that letter theme. Oh no. Oh,
right at the end. Almost at the buzzer.
What happened? What was the word? What did I hit?
Letter.
Letter was the magical mystery word of today.
Cheers to you all.
Clink.
Ooh. I didn't need that.
I don't know. I don't want to slag this song at all because I believe it, and maybe I've belabored the point, but I believe it to be of its time. You know, I don't. I would say that Paul felt all of these things.
So maybe for different reasons, right? We both enjoy this song. I'm leaning more towards what the band is doing, and you're leaning more towards what the instruments are doing. But at the end of the day, we need to rank it. And
oh, yes.
I think we need to put it on the list, and we need to look at where we've come to this point, and we need to look at where we're going. And here's what I'm going to say.
This is a tough one, though. It's tough. This is tough.
I agree.
Yeah. Because we are going to put it up on the big board.
And there are going to be times when we agree and times when we disagree, Becker. And we're going to have to come to consensus.
This might be the only time that we can come together.
I'm going to put this song number 1.
Whew.
Right now?
Yep.
Of all the songs that we have spoke about, you're putting this as number 1?
I'm willing to do it. Yeah, this is number 1.
I also put it as number 1. Let's hear it for All My Loving.
Let's have a cheers.
Number 1.
Cheers for All My
Beatles
Loving.
song so far.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
Thanks for hanging out with the Blotto Beatles. We have a lot more for you. As you know, we are committing to hanging out here for 200 plus songs. If you like what you heard, there's only more of it to come.
I'm just going to remind you, please follow us at Blotto Beatles on Instagram, Twitter, or drop us an email, blottobeatles@gmail.com. Let us know the next song you'd like to hear. And producer Scotty C will decide if it's worthy of entrance to the show.